My name is Staff Sergeant Erin Callahan. I'm 29 years old. I spent 10 months overseas, and the day I finally came home, my parents weren't standing in the crowd waiting for me. They were 40 minutes away, at my sister's gender reveal party, because as my mother put it, "You've done this before, Erin. This is Rachel's first baby." What none of us knew yet, what wouldn't come out until the following week, was that my battalion commander had a very specific reason to personally call our house that week. He just ended up on the phone with the wrong sister. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever come home to an empty crowd when you needed someone there most, comment "I've been there" below. This one's for you. I enlisted at 22, after 2 years of community college convinced me I wanted structure more than I wanted a degree I wasn't using. 8 years in, I was a staff sergeant with a logistics unit, the kind of job that doesn't make it into movies: fuel convoys, supply manifests, keeping a battalion's worth of equipment moving on schedule in places where nothing about on schedule comes naturally. My 10th-month deployment was my third overseas rotation, and by that point my family had developed a kind of practiced calm around them. Not indifference, exactly. More like the specific, worn smooth normalcy that happens when something that would terrify a stranger becomes, through repetition, just another season on the calendar. My mother would say her version of a goodbye at the airport. My father would tell me to be careful in the same flat tone he used for reminding me to check my oil, and then life at home would continue without much visible disruption, texts and video calls filling in the gaps until I came back. I didn't resent that calm, not exactly. I understood it as its own kind of coping. What I didn't fully register, until the year I'm about to describe, was how easily that calm had curdled into something closer to assumption, the quiet family belief that whatever I was doing overseas, and whatever I needed when I came home, could always wait, because I always came home eventually, and there would always be a later available for me specifically. I want to describe, briefly and without much drama, what actually happened during that deployment, because it matters for what comes later, even though I didn't lead with it to my own family at the time. 6 months into the rotation, a supply convoy I was overseeing was hit by an IED on a road we'd used without incident for weeks. Nobody died. That's the detail I held on to hardest afterward. But 2 soldiers were seriously injured, and in the chaos immediately following the blast, I made the call to reroute our medevac request through a secondary channel when our primary radio link went down, a decision that, according to the after-action report filed later, likely saved several minutes that mattered more than anyone wanted to admit out loud. I didn't think about it as heroic in the moment. I thought about it as doing my job under pressure, the same way I'd trained to. The seconds after the blast are still, honestly, a little blurred in my memory: dust, a ringing quiet where the radio chatter should have been, one of our medics already moving before I'd fully processed what had happened. What I remember clearly is the decision itself. Our primary comms link was down, and rather than waste time trying to re-establish it, I had our driver pull the vehicle's backup radio and patch through a secondary frequency we'd used exactly once before, in a training exercise 8 months earlier. It worked. The medevac bird was overhead in a fraction of the time it would have taken through normal channels. It was only afterward, in the debrief, that my company commander used the word commendation, and it was only near the end of my deployment that I learned the battalion was recommending me for a formal award, an Army Commendation Medal with a Valor device, to be presented publicly at our homecoming ceremony. I remember feeling almost embarrassed by the word Valor attached to my name, the way I imagine most people who've actually been in that kind of moment feel about language that sounds bigger than what the moment itself felt like from the inside. I told my family almost none of this while I was still overseas. Partly operational caution, some details genuinely weren't mine to share yet, pending the after-action review, but mostly a habit I'd built over 3 deployments of downplaying anything that might worry them from 4,000 miles away. I'd learned, over the years, that describing anything remotely dangerous to my mother produced a specific kind of anxious spiral that neither of us could do anything about from opposite sides of the planet, so I'd developed a practice of simply not doing it. I mentioned, in one phone call home, that something good might happen at the homecoming ceremony, and left it at that. I assumed there'd be time to explain the rest in person, standing in front of them, in a moment I'd been picturing, on and off, for months. My parents, Linda and Gary Callahan, raised me and my younger sister Rachel in a house where love was real but attention was a limited resource, quietly allocated toward whatever felt most immediate. Rachel is 26, married to a good, mild-mannered man named Connor, and at the time of this story, 6 months pregnant with their first child, the first grandchild on either side of the family. I don't say any of this to diminish what that pregnancy meant to my parents. A first grandchild is a genuinely enormous thing, and I understood, even at the time, why it commanded a certain gravitational pull on the family's attention that my own comings and goings, by that point, simply didn't generate in the same way. But there's a difference between a family's attention naturally gravitating towards something exciting and new, and a family actively choosing that thing over a specific, non-repeatable moment that mattered to someone else. I didn't fully understand that difference until the week of my homecoming made it impossible to ignore. Looking back, I can trace the shape of this pattern further back than that one week. My high school graduation had been scheduled the same weekend as a cousin's destination wedding, and my parents had split the difference by attending my ceremony but skipping the reception I'd helped organize for my graduating class. When I finished my initial training and earned a meritorious promotion, the news arrived on the same day Rachel got into her first-choice college, and I remember distinctly that the phone call home spent almost the entire time on Rachel's acceptance letter before circling back, briefly, to congratulate me. None of these, individually, had felt like much. They were the kind of small, forgivable imbalances every family accumulates without anyone keeping score. I certainly wasn't keeping score, not consciously. But score, it turns out, doesn't require a scorekeeper to still be accumulating somewhere. Homecoming ceremonies for a battalion-sized unit get scheduled months in advance, coordinated with base public affairs, family readiness groups, and, in units where soldiers are receiving public commendations, local media outreach. Ours was locked in for a Saturday morning in October, announced to families nearly 10 weeks ahead of time through the official family readiness channels my mother was on. I called home the week the date was announced, genuinely excited in a way I didn't fully let myself feel out loud during most of a deployment. "Put it on the calendar," I told my mother. "I really want you all there. There's going to be some kind of ceremony thing. I think I'm getting some kind of award. I don't totally know the details yet, but I want you there for it." My mother said, of course, they'd be there, the whole family, and for a while, that was simply the plan. The complication arrived roughly 6 weeks later, when Rachel, coordinating her own gender reveal party with a venue she'd been trying to book for months, learned that the outdoor pavilion she wanted, the only one in town large enough for the crowd she was planning, had a single opening left before the end of the season. That opening fell on the same Saturday as my homecoming. I want to note, because it matters for how the rest of this unfolded, that Rachel did have other options at that point, even if none were quite as ideal. A different venue 20 minutes further out had 2 open weekends the following month, and a friend of hers had already offered her own backyard as a fallback if the pavilion fell through. Rachel considered both, briefly, before deciding, reasonably enough, on its own, that the pavilion was worth holding out for, given how much of her planning, including a professional photographer she'd already booked, was built around its specific layout. I want to be fair to how this actually unfolded, because I don't think anyone sat down and consciously decided my homecoming mattered less than a gender reveal party. I think, instead, a series of small, individually reasonable-sounding justifications accumulated into a decision that, looked at all at once, was much harder to justify than any of its individual pieces. Rachel called our mother first, distraught about the venue conflict, and floated the idea of simply having both events on the same day in the same general area, since, as she put it, everyone's already going to be in town anyway for Erin's thing. My mother, from what I pieced together afterward, initially suggested Rachel find another venue, a smaller option that had availability the following month instead. But Rachel pushed back, gently at first and then more insistently, pointing out that October was the only month before winter that made sense for an outdoor reveal, that this pavilion was uniquely suited to the big reveal moment she'd been planning with a color smoke cannon rental that only that venue permitted, and that, the detail that seemed to tip things, several of Connor's out-of-state relatives had already arranged time off work for that specific weekend and couldn't easily Rearrange. My mother brought the scheduling conflict to my father, who, according to what I learned later, said something to the effect of, "Erin's homecoming isn't going anywhere. She'll still be home when we get there. Rachel's window is actually closing." That framing, that my homecoming was a fixed, always available fact, while Rachel's party had a hard, unmovable deadline, became, without much further discussion, the operating logic for the rest of the week. Nobody called to tell me directly that they wouldn't be at the ceremony itself. Instead, I got a text message from my mother 3 days before homecoming, the kind of message clearly composed to sound softer than its actual content. "Sweetheart, so excited you're coming home. Quick heads up, Rachel's gender reveal ended up landing on the same day as your ceremony, venue nightmare, don't ask, grinning face with sweat. We're going to swing by hers first since it's timed and then come straight to base after, might miss the very beginning but we'll for sure see you that day." I read that message standing in a supply tent 8,000 miles from home, 48 hours before I was scheduled to board a flight that would end with me walking off a bus onto a tarmac in front of a crowd of families holding signs and balloons. I remember reading it twice, checking whether I was misunderstanding something, before I understood that I wasn't. I called my mother that night. She sounded surprised that I was upset, in the specific way people sound surprised when they've genuinely convinced themselves, in advance, that a decision won't land the way it's about to land. "You've done this before, Erin," she said, a phrase I'd hear again, almost word for word, at least 3 more times before that week was over. "This is Rachel's first baby. We just don't want to miss that moment for her." I asked whether they understood there was going to be a public ceremony, an award, something specific happening that day that wasn't going to repeat itself the way a homecoming, in the abstract, technically could. My mother's answer was, essentially, that they'd be there for the important part, just not right at the start, and that I shouldn't make this into a competition between the girls, a phrase that told me, more than almost anything else that week, how completely she'd already reframed the situation in her own mind. I came home on a Saturday morning in October, on a bus that pulled onto the base parade field a little after 9, in front of a crowd that included, by my estimate, somewhere around 300 family members holding signs, kids on shoulders, a scattering of small American flags. I remember scanning that crowd from the bus window in the specific, involuntary way I imagine everyone does, looking for the faces you've spent 10 months picturing. I didn't find them. Not at first, and not by the time the ceremony's formal portion began roughly 20 minutes later. What I did find, standing near the front with a hand-painted sign that said "Welcome Home, Erin," was my best friend Maya, a fellow staff sergeant from a different unit who'd rotated home 2 months earlier and driven 6 hours that morning specifically to be there. Beside her stood my boyfriend of 2 years, Dev, holding a bouquet that suddenly looked, in that empty stretch of crowd around them, both generous and slightly heartbreaking. I want to be honest that I'm not entirely sure, standing on that field, whether I fully registered yet how empty the space around Maya and Dev actually was, relative to how full the field was everywhere else. I think some part of me was still holding on to my mother's text, "We'll for sure see you that day," as a kind of promise still technically in play. The formal ceremony took place about 45 minutes after the buses arrived, once families had a chance to reunite and the battalion had time to form up properly. I stood in formation, in the front row of my company, close enough to the small stage and podium that had been set up for the day's remarks that I could see the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hastings, reviewing a folder of notes before he stepped up to speak. I knew, in general terms, that some kind of award presentation was planned, but I hadn't been told exactly when in the ceremony it would happen, or exactly how it would be framed publicly. What I didn't expect was for Colonel Hastings to specifically call my name, ask me to step forward out of formation, and read, in front of the entire assembled battalion and every family member present, a detailed account of the convoy incident from 6 months earlier, the IED, the disrupted communications, the decision to reroute the medevac request through a secondary channel, and the 2 soldiers whose recovery times, according to the after-action report he was quoting from, had genuinely benefited from those extra minutes. He pinned an Army Commendation Medal with a Valor device to my uniform in front of roughly 300 family members, none of whom, as far as I could tell in that moment, were mine. I want to describe what that specific kind of aloneness feels like, because I think it's different from ordinary loneliness. It's not the absence of people around you. The field was full of people, full of noise and applause. It's the specific, isolating awareness that the noise and the applause are happening for everyone else's family except yours, in a moment that was supposed to be, at least in part, about proving to the people who raised you that the last 10 months had mattered. After the formal ceremony ended, families were released to find their soldiers on the field, and I stood there watching reunions happen in every direction, parents lifting children, spouses running the last few steps, grandparents crying openly. Maya reached me first, hugging me hard enough that I nearly lost my footing, and Dev followed with the bouquet and a kiss that I remember being genuinely grateful for, even through the specific numbness I was feeling. "Where's your family?" Maya asked, scanning the field the way I had from the bus window, clearly expecting them to appear at any second. "They're coming," I said. "There's a scheduling thing." I want to be honest about what I felt in the next hour, standing on that field in my dress uniform with a medal I'd genuinely earned pinned to my chest, waiting for a family that, as time passed, increasingly clearly wasn't going to arrive during any part of the ceremony itself. It wasn't rage, not in that moment. It was a specific, quiet humiliation, the awareness that everyone around me could see, without my needing to explain it, that my family's absence wasn't a scheduling accident but a choice, and that whatever explanation I gave afterward would sound, to anyone listening, like the kind of thing people say when they're covering for people who've let them down. My parents and Rachel's husband Connor eventually arrived a little after 1 in the afternoon, nearly 4 hours after the buses had landed, well past the formal ceremony, well past the medal presentation, well past the window when most families had already collected their soldiers and left for lunch. Rachel herself didn't come at all, staying at the reveal party venue with her own mother-in-law to manage cleanup, something I only learned later was itself a choice rather than a necessity. My mother hugged me tightly when she finally found me, genuinely emotional in a way that made clear she wasn't being callous on purpose. She'd simply organized her sense of priorities in a way that made this outcome feel, to her, like a reasonable compromise rather than the significant absence it actually was. "We're so sorry we missed the start," she said. "The reveal ran long. You would not believe the smoke cannon situation. It took like 45 minutes just to get everyone positioned for photos." "How was it? Did they say anything nice?" I told her, briefly, about the medal, the citation, the specifics of the convoy incident that Colonel Hastings had read aloud to 300 people. I watched my mother's face do something complicated, genuine surprise, followed quickly by a kind of scrambling attempt to catch up emotionally to information she was hearing secondhand, hours after the moment it was meant to land in. "Oh, honey, I had no idea it was that serious," she said. "You never really told us what happened out there." "I told you something good might happen at the ceremony," I said. "I didn't get into the details because I wanted to tell you in person." "At the ceremony." My father, for his part, said less, offering a firm handshake-turned hug and a comment about how proud he was, delivered in a tone that felt, to me in that moment, indistinguishable from how he might have said it about literally any accomplishment, regardless of what he'd actually witnessed or missed. "Is it Erin's turn now?" my mother asked, meaning what, I still don't fully know, whether some second ceremony existed I hadn't been told about, or whether she was simply asking, in the vaguest possible terms, what came next. I told her no, that was it, that had been the entire ceremony, and that it had already happened, without them, hours earlier. Connor, who'd come along with my parents once his own duties at Rachel's party wound down, seemed to sense the tension building under the surface of the conversation more clearly than my parents did. "The reveal really did run long," he offered, almost apologetically, as though he could feel some responsibility to smooth things over on his wife's behalf. "The smoke cannon jammed twice. It became this whole production." I appreciated the attempt, even though it didn't change anything about the 4 empty hours that had already passed. We ended up going to a late lunch near base, the 4 of us, at a restaurant I'd chosen mostly because it was close and I didn't have the energy to negotiate anywhere else. My mother spent a good portion of the meal showing me photos from the reveal on her phone, Rachel and Connor laughing under a cloud of pink smoke, my mother herself beaming in nearly every frame, narrating each one with a warmth that, without her seeming to notice it, made the contrast with our own conversation feel even sharper. I nodded along, not because I wanted to see the photos particularly, but because I didn't yet have the language to explain what I actually needed from that lunch, which wasn't more photos of a party I hadn't attended, but some acknowledgement of the one I had. Over the following days, the family group chat filled up with photos from Rachel's gender reveal, pink smoke billowing dramatically over a crowd of 40 or 50 people, Rachel and Connor laughing, hands raised, my mother visibly overjoyed in nearly every frame. I looked at those photos with a feeling I didn't expect, not jealousy of the moment itself, which looked genuinely happy, but a specific, growing clarity about exactly how my family had spent the hours they'd chosen not to spend with me. I posted, eventually, a single message to the chat, a photo Maya had taken of me on the field, medal pinned to my chest, and a short caption, "Home safe. Got a Commendation Medal with Valor for something that happened back in April. Wish you all could have seen it." The responses that came back were warm in tone and almost entirely absent of any acknowledgement of the specific choice that had been made that day. My mother wrote, "So proud of you. We'll celebrate properly soon." Rachel wrote a heart emoji and, separately, a message thanking everyone again for coming to her reveal, apparently not registering, or not wanting to register, that the two messages were sitting in the same conversation thread within minutes of each other. Nobody, in that group chat, said anything close to, "We should have been there for the actual ceremony, and we're sorry we weren't." A few days after homecoming, Maya called me, ostensibly to check in about how I was settling back into life stateside, though I think we both understood the real reason for the call was the empty stretch of field she'd watched me stand in that Saturday. "I wasn't going to say anything unless you brought it up," she said, "but I keep thinking about your face when the colonel called your name and you looked out at the crowd first, before you even stepped forward. I've known you 7 years. I've never seen you look like that." I told her I hadn't fully processed what my own face had done in that moment, that I'd been too busy trying to keep my composure in front of 300 strangers to notice what I looked like doing it. Maya, who'd been through her own complicated homecoming 2 months earlier, her parents divorced, her father remarried to someone Maya had never met, both sets of extended family awkwardly present but barely speaking to each other, offered the kind of specific, hard-won empathy that only comes from someone who stood in a similar kind of aloneness herself, even if the exact shape of it was different. "You don't have to pretend it didn't matter," she said. "The medal is real. What happened out there is real. And so is being hurt that nobody who raised you was standing there to watch it happen." About 10 days after homecoming, Base Family Readiness sent out an invitation to a smaller, more formal event, a recognition breakfast hosted by the battalion for the families of soldiers who'd received commendations, with Colonel Hastings personally attending to speak with each family individually. The invitation had gone, per standard procedure, to whichever family member I'd listed as my primary emergency and readiness contact years earlier when I first enlisted, my mother, Linda Callahan. That week happened to be an unusually chaotic one at my parents' house. My mother was juggling a follow-up ultrasound appointment for Rachel, a cake tasting for the eventual baby shower, and a work deadline of her own, and had, without much thought, forwarded her house line to Rachel's cell for a few days, just in case anything important comes through, a small, practical decision that ended up mattering more than anyone anticipated. When Colonel Hastings's aide, a young captain named Diaz, called that Tuesday to confirm attendance and go over a few details about the breakfast, the call reached Rachel instead of my mother, a small administrative accident that neither the captain nor Rachel had any reason to suspect was anything other than perfectly ordinary. Rachel picked up assuming it was something related to her own upcoming baby shower logistics, since she'd been handling a dozen similar calls that week, caterers, the photographer, a florist trying to confirm a delivery window. Captain Diaz introduced himself, mentioned he was calling on behalf of Lieutenant Colonel Hastings regarding the Callahan family's attendance at Saturday's recognition breakfast for Staff Sergeant Callahan, and asked to confirm numbers. Rachel, by her own later account, was confused for a moment before piecing together that this was about me, and, rather than immediately correcting the mistake and handing the phone to our mother, stayed on the line, curious, and asked a few questions of her own, the way anyone might when unexpectedly given direct access to information they didn't previously have. "I'm sorry, can I ask," Rachel said, "what exactly is this breakfast for? I know she got some kind of award, but I wasn't totally clear on the details." Captain Diaz, assuming he was speaking with an appropriately informed family member, seemed genuinely a little surprised at the question, given how significant the incident had been within the battalion's own internal accounting of the rotation. He mentioned, in the course of confirming details, that Colonel Hastings had specifically asked that this particular family be included, given that Staff Sergeant Callahan's actions during the convoy incident had been one of the more significant individual contributions the battalion was recognizing that rotation, and that the colonel wanted a chance to personally thank the family for their support during what had clearly been a difficult and consequential deployment. "Consequential how?" Rachel asked. "I mean, I know she was overseas, obviously. I didn't realize something actually happened to her unit." Rachel, again by her own account to me later, went quiet for a moment on the phone, before asking the captain directly what exactly had happened during the incident he was referring to. Captain Diaz, still under the impression he was speaking to a fully informed family member, gave Rachel a more detailed account than I'd given my own mother in person: the IED, the injured soldiers, my decision under pressure to reroute the medevac request through a secondary channel, and the specific note in the after-action report crediting that decision with meaningfully reducing the 2 soldiers' time to receive treatment. He mentioned, too, that one of those soldiers had a wife and a 2-year-old at home, details that landed, for Rachel, with a specificity that a vague "she got an award" summary never could have carried on its own. He also mentioned, almost in passing, that Colonel Hastings had personally remarked, while reviewing that week's family attendance numbers from the homecoming ceremony, that he'd noticed the Callahan family seats appeared to be empty during the medal presentation itself, and had asked whether everything was all right at home, a comment the captain relayed simply as color, a small aside meant to convey how closely the colonel tracked these things, not realizing how it would land on the other end of the line. "He asked about us specifically?" Rachel said. "By name?" "He mentioned the Callahan family, yes," Captain Diaz said. "He does that with most of the families he's presenting awards to. It's sort of his practice to notice who's there. I think he just wanted to make sure nothing was wrong." Rachel told me later that this was the exact sentence that made the entire morning of the reveal party rearrange itself in her memory, no longer a happy, uncomplicated afternoon, but a specific set of hours that a stranger, with no reason to exaggerate or guilt her, had flagged as noticeably, unusually empty. Rachel told me later that this was the moment the entire shape of that day finally became clear to her, not in the abstract way she'd already half understood it, but in the specific, undeniable way that comes from hearing a stranger, someone with no personal stake in the family's internal dynamics, describe your own absence back to you as something noticeable enough that a battalion commander had personally asked about it. She thanked the aide, confirmed the family's attendance for the breakfast, and hung up the phone. She told me she sat at our parents' kitchen table for a long time afterward before telling anyone what had just happened. Rachel called me that evening, and I want to describe her tone honestly, because it wasn't defensive in the way I might have expected. It was, instead, quiet in a way I hadn't heard from her before. "I didn't know," she said. "About what actually happened. I mean, I knew you were somewhere dangerous, obviously, but I didn't know I didn't know a commanding officer was going to stand up in front of 300 people and describe you saving someone's life. I thought it was just a normal homecoming with some kind of generic award." "It wasn't generic," I said, keeping my voice even. "But I also didn't explain it to you ahead of time, because I wanted to tell you in person, at the ceremony. Which none of you were at." "I know," she said, and then, after a pause, the colonel's assistant said he asked why our seats were empty. Erin, a battalion commander, noticed we weren't there. I don't know how to describe how that made me feel, hearing a total stranger say that back to me. I told her, honestly, that I appreciated her calling to tell me this, and that I wasn't interested in making her feel worse than the phone call apparently already had. But I also told her, for the first time plainly, what the day had actually felt like from where I was standing, the empty seats, the 4-hour gap before anyone arrived, the specific loneliness of receiving a medal in front of everyone else's family but mine. My entire family attended the recognition breakfast that Saturday, my parents, Rachel, and Connor, all present a full 30 minutes before the scheduled start time, a level of promptness I noted privately without saying anything out loud. Colonel Hastings spent a few minutes with each honored soldier's family individually, and when he reached ours, he shook my parents' hands warmly and repeated, in more detail than the aide had given Rachel, the specifics of the convoy incident, adding a detail I hadn't even heard before, that one of the 2 injured soldiers had since sent a letter to the battalion specifically asking that it be shared with my family, thanking them for raising someone who made the call she did under pressure. I watched my mother's composure fully give way for the first time that week, tears streaming freely as she listened to a stranger describe, in specific and consequential terms, exactly what her daughter had actually done overseas, details she was hearing, in full, for the first time, 10 days after the ceremony where they'd been announced to everyone except her. "I am so sorry we weren't there," she said to me quietly, once Colonel Hastings had moved on to the next family. "I don't think I understood, until just now, what we actually missed. I thought I was choosing between 2 happy family moments. I didn't realize I was choosing to miss the moment my daughter needed us the most." I don't want to describe what happened after that breakfast as some instant, permanent transformation in how my family thought about my service, because I don't think that's honest. What I can say is that something specific and concrete shifted, in a way that outlasted the immediate embarrassment of that week. My father, a few weeks later, asked me directly, for what I believe was the first time in 8 years of service, to sit down and actually explain, in detail, what my job involved day to day, not as small talk but as a genuine question he wanted answered. My mother started asking, before any future deployment, specific questions about dates and ceremonies months in advance, rather than assuming, as she once had, that whatever I was doing could simply flex around whatever else the family had scheduled. Rachel, for her part, named her son, born 4 months later, with my name as his middle name, a gesture she offered without much explanation beyond telling me, quietly, that she wanted him to grow up knowing there was a specific reason for it, once he was old enough to understand what actually happened the year he was born. People who hear this story sometimes expect me to say I confronted my family furiously, or that I orchestrated some clever way to make sure the colonel's office reached Rachel instead of my mother, engineering the whole reveal as a kind of quiet revenge. I didn't. The forwarded phone line was an accident, a small, unremarkable scheduling choice that happened to land in exactly the place it needed to land for the truth to finally surface on its own terms. What I learned, watching that accident unfold, is that some patterns don't require confrontation to break. Sometimes they just require the truth to reach the right person, through whatever ordinary, unplanned channel happens to carry it, at a moment when that person is finally paying close enough attention to actually hear it. I don't think my family set out to hurt me by choosing Rachel's reveal that day. I think, like a lot of families, they'd quietly assumed for years that whatever I was doing overseas could always wait, because I always came home eventually, and there would always be time later to properly celebrate whatever I'd missed being celebrated for the first time around. What that Saturday taught all of us, in different ways, is that later isn't actually guaranteed, and that a homecoming ceremony, unlike a gender reveal party, doesn't get a second scheduled date. I still love my family, and I understood, even in the hardest moment of that homecoming, that their absence came from a specific miscalculation about time and priority rather than any real indifference to what I do. But I no longer assume, the way I once did, that being the family member who handles things well and doesn't make a fuss means my own moments will simply be understood as important without my ever having to say so directly. I've since learned to be plainer about what actually matters to me, ahead of time, rather than trusting that the people who love me will simply intuit it correctly on their own. And I've learned that sometimes, the clearest correction to a pattern doesn't come from an argument at all. It comes quietly, through an ordinary phone call that was never supposed to reach the person it reached, carrying, almost by accident, exactly the truth that needed to be heard. If you've ever had someone else's ordinary day accidentally reveal something your own family had been avoiding for years, I'd love to hear how it happened, and what changed afterward. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.